All right, let's talk about axes and the differences between a tool axe and a battle axe, which can be somewhat tricky. This is supposed to be mainly an open discussion as opposed to a lecture. I don't claim to be an expert, but I'll try to stimulate some thought and get a discussion going, and I'll try to make this as informative as possible. So let's start out with a dictionary definition of what is an axe. According to Merriam-Webster, it's a cutting tool that consists of a heavy-edged head fixed to a handle with the edge parallel to the handle, and that is used especially for felling trees and chopping and splitting wood. It defines a battle axe as a broad axe formerly used as a weapon of war. Also, a usually older woman who is sharp-tongued, domineering, or combative. I wasn't aware of that, but apparently it's a thing. Then the Oxford Dictionary defines a battle axe as a large, broad-bladed axe used in ancient warfare. Not necessarily true. There are actually battle axes with small heads as well, especially in antiquity. The Free Dictionary defines an axe as a tool with a bladed, usually heavy head mounted crosswise on a handle used for felling trees or chopping wood, or alternatively, any of various bladed handheld implements used as a cutting tool or weapon. Which is a little odd because that would make a knife an axe, but yeah, that's a very encompassing, broad, little vague definition. And then there's also the term tomahawk, which Merriam-Webster defines as a light axe used as a missile and a hand weapon, especially by North American Indians. And sometimes when you talk about something like this, somebody may jump at you and quote-unquote correct you and say, nope, that's not an axe, it's a tomahawk. But it is an axe. Axe is just the general broad term that, kind of an umbrella term, if you will. Not every axe is a tomahawk, but every tomahawk is an axe. And you can see that in this definition here. Tomahawk, a light axe. How about distinguishing between a weapon and a tool? This here is definitely designed as a weapon. This here was commonly used as a weapon, but it could also be a tool. And this is very specifically a tool. This is a forest axe. Would not make for a great weapon. Okay, so first of all, let's start out with the tool. The one that is unambiguously a tool. So it's designed for felling trees, chopping wood, splitting wood. Actual felling axes would be a lot larger than this, and they would also have a larger and especially heavier head. They tend to be relatively thick, have a strong wedge shape on the head, which makes them good for splitting. Something like this, on the other hand, feels a lot more agile. It's not very heavy, especially if you have a long handle. It's pretty easy to use. You can definitely do a pretty strong strike and still stay in a guard position without completely overswinging and exposing yourself. And also the way the head is shaped shows you that it's designed as a weapon, because this upswept horn, as it's sometimes called, just wouldn't serve any purpose for chopping wood. It would be rather pointless, even though it is Okay, I'll stop. But yes, that is an indication that you're supposed to be able to thrust with this. And you wouldn't thrust against a tree. That's rather silly. The most obvious case of an axe that is clearly designed as a weapon is this, the Dane axe. A two-handed axe used by Vikings and Saxons. And it has an almost comically large head. And if this was made as a tool axe, with the thickness that you require for chopping wood, this would be ludicrously heavy. I mean, you could forget about using it properly. But this can get away with it because it is very, very thin. It is pretty much about as thin as a sword blade. In fact, you could even argue that some sword blades are thicker. This thing is surprisingly light when you pick it up. It is very easy to handle, very agile. You can quickly strike with it. It doesn't tire you out, and it cuts very well. Not only because it is such a thin blade, but also because it has a very long edge. So with an edge like this, you can actually do kind of a slicing cut. So you don't have to just chop, you can actually slice through the target as well. And you can also thrust with it to an extent, you can hook with it, of course. It makes for a very good weapon. As a tool, yeah, not so much. If you try to fell an axe, fell an axe with a tree? No, if you try to fell a tree with this, you would most likely bend it or break it. You would just screw it up. So this simply wouldn't work. However, there's also plenty of gray zone. If you look at this, for instance, the Valaška or shepherd's axe, it can be a little confusing in terms of design. If I didn't know anything about how people use this traditionally, I would just look at this, at the relatively small but thick head, and I would say this is probably a tool axe. And yes, it was used as a tool, but it was also used as a weapon. And if you look at the other side, you may think, oh, this is obviously a weapon because it has a butt spike. But people commonly use this as a walking stick. And that's the purpose of that, from what I understand. You use that to get better grip on the ground. So it's not necessarily for use as a weapon, even though you could. But yes, axes like this were used as walking stick, tool, weapon, whatever the situation required, basically. And you could, of course, say that, well, you could just call it a tool in general. You can say there is such a thing as a fighting tool. A tool is simply an implement that you use for a specific purpose in a situation. And then there's this, which also could be either. From what I understand, bearded axes are usually interpreted as weapons, but it may just as well be a tool. And that is kind of the point. I mean, who says you have to distinguish between a tool axe and a battle axe necessarily? Tool and weapon is often interchangeable. You can use a tool as a weapon. In some situations, you can use a weapon as a tool. It's really an artificial distinction for the most part, unless you're dealing with a design that is clearly not very practical for one or the other. But axes like these are mostly equally suitable for either fighting or tool use. I personally see some issues with the short-edged blade axe heads, mainly because they would be a lot more likely to get stuck in the body. And yeah, now we get into the macabre details. If you have no interest in historical martial arts, you will probably not enjoy this, but then again, why are you watching this in the first place? So the issue that I see with a short-edged axe head like this is if it enters the body, it can easily get stuck between bones. You know, it can kind of be lodged in between two ribs, say, or the top or bottom of the blade could be hooked behind a bone and thereby get stuck. So this may be more difficult to extract than especially something like this. But there were plenty of battle axes with short heads throughout history, especially in antiquity. That was pretty common, but later as well. And finally, I'd like to read to you some of what Ewart Oakeshott wrote in his book, The Archaeology of Weapons, about axes. So first off, the migration period, also called Dark Ages, which is sometimes set between the year 300 and 700 and sometimes between 400 and 800. So I quote, "Axes were used a good deal, but only a few are really distinguishable as weapons from others, which could equally well have been designed for the humdrum purpose of cutting wood. Axes have often been found in the graves, but I believe one should not, because of that, assume they were always weapons of war." Then for the Viking Age, which is typically set between 793 and 1066, he says, "These axes were far more effective weapons than the ones which belong to the earlier centuries. These Viking axes are enormous and terrible weapons whose edges are often as much as 12 inches long. They were indeed battle axes. We cannot confuse them like the earlier ones with domestic axes. They had their poetic names too. The Fiend of the Shield, Battle Witch, the Wound's Wolf," also terms like the Witch of the Bernese. And they had all kinds of interesting poetic terms for axes. Then for the Middle Ages, and exactly how you define that period, where you set the start and end, is debatable. Some say between about 500 and 1500. Others set the start at about 800. But regardless, the axe was widely used during the 12th and 13th centuries. In the 11th, it had been regarded as rather an ungentlemanly weapon by continental warriors. Only Saxons and Scandinavians considered it fit for any save churls. But by the early 12th century, it has become respectable, and we find knightly warriors wielding it. That is this kind of axe here, a Hungarian two-handed axe, which is an example of a medieval battle axe. So yes, as you can see, in some cases, it's pretty clear that we're dealing with an object designed as a weapon. In other cases, it's more ambiguous. Sometimes a Viking warrior who couldn't afford a sword would simply grab an axe because it's much cheaper, and it can also be used for chopping wood if necessary. And also, whenever any kind of object is used to assault or defend against another human being or animal, it is by law generally considered a weapon. A table leg could suddenly become a weapon, or a bottle, or a carpenter's hammer. All kinds of things. So we should keep that in mind. There is not necessarily such a clear distinction, and quite often archaeologists say tool or weapon because it's hard to tell, and there's probably not too much of a point in trying to be very specific about the distinction. So yes, that's about all I've got for now. I hope this was informative, and thanks for watching.